Thanks for being here. It's great to be with you all today. You've got a name. I'm not going to give you this one. I don't have a name tag for you, but you have one out there, right? Yeah, right. Okay. Okay. This is my name tag game. Get to know people's names. All right. Welcome. It's great to be with you as we continue in this exploration of exploring the Episcopal, I just call it exploring the Episcopal experience, getting to know the particular characteristic of this denomination of Christ's body, because there are many, as you know, many denominations of Christ's body. So let us pray today. Actually, this is in the Book of Common Prayer, page 817. Why don't you open up to page 817 before I pray? You know, in the Christian tradition, there are denominations whose character is that praying extemporaneously is really important. I mean, it just is the character of the denominational structure, right? So being able to just stop and pray out loud for whatever is going on, whatever you feel a need, concern for, is kind of a characteristic of the denominational ethos, if you will. For those of you who have been in the Episcopal Church a long time, you know that that's not particularly the ethos of the Episcopal Church. It's not that it doesn't happen, it's just not a particular ethos. And so there's a shadow side and there's a light side to everything. Everything in life. Even the thing you love the most, there's probably still a shadow side that you love it so much, right? So this is a similar characteristic, right? So the shadow side to extemporaneous character of prayer, and that being the ethos, is that somehow you have to come up with the words for everything. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I don't have the words for what I need to pray for. I just don't got them. For whatever reason, maybe I'm exhausted. Maybe it's hitting me too hard, so I don't have the words, right? And so almost every situation you might come across, there's a prayer for that in the Book of Common Prayer. And it's okay. We're a community of faith. We don't always have to be the one that comes up with the words for the care that is on our hearts. Right? Now, the shadow side in our own ethos is that I asked somebody to say grace and I can't even say grace with them. Right? So, page 817, let's look for the parish for this particular, at the bottom of the page. Almighty and ever-living God, ruler of all things in heaven and earth, hear our prayer for this parish family. Strengthen the faithful, arouse the careless, and restore the penitent. Grant us all things necessary for our common life, and bring us all to be of one heart and mind within your holy church, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay. Today we're going to move into looking at both the structure and then some theologies, if you will, here in the Episcopal Church with the Book of Common Prayer. So that is going to be one of our focus today. But I want to finish up some historical pieces. We've done history really through so far, and so let me just go backwards. I've done a little bit of Episcopal Church history, how the Episcopal Church in the United States of America came out from the Church of England, and at the time of the Revolution, here in the United States, we had to create our own denomination because we were no longer part of the Church of England. Though our heritage, our prayers, our prayer book, all is the same family, if you will, the same family of faith. And there is throughout the world a similar situations with the Church of England, because of course, Britain was an empire. And this empire conquered areas of the world, and wherever they conquered an area of the world, they planted the Church of England. So wherever you might go, where the British Empire had a significant presence, you will find what are called Anglican churches. Anglican is the name, the term that is used in England for churches of the Church of England. And it's also used for all of these churches throughout the world that found their heritage from the Church of England. Anglican. It comes from the etymology of the word comes from the tribe, the Angles, which came into England, and it comes down. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on etymology, but it comes down through there. So wherever you hear the word Anglican, it's referring to the Church of England and or culturally the Church of England and churches throughout the world that take their heritage from the Church of England. I'm going to move over a little bit so maybe those looking online that way can still see me. So throughout the world, there are denominations that are Anglican. So the Anglican Church of Canada, instead of the Episcopal Church of Canada, it's called the Anglican Church of Canada. It's a separate denomination. It no longer is part of the Church of England. It's a separate denomination, but it's called the Anglican Church of Canada. The Anglican Church of Australia, New Zealand, India, wherever the British Empire was strong, if you will, there are to this day Anglican churches throughout the world. And so we consider ourselves, we are the Episcopal Church in the United States is an Anglican church, right? What makes a church Anglican besides its descendants, that it descends from the Church of England? Well, there's one more little piece of characteristic that makes a church Anglican. So if we back up a little bit, the British Empire starts falling apart in certain places in the late 1800s, and then more and more through the early 1900s, right? I think India became independent in the 30s, was it maybe, or 40s? Was it the 40s? And that was really the last big country to no longer be formally a part of the British Empire. So the question becomes, how do we hold together all these churches throughout the world that used to be the Church of England, but now are separate denominations? Should we try to hold them together in some way, right? And so the idea came about that that we'll all consider ourselves related through the Archbishop of Canterbury, right? The Archbishop of Canterbury in England is the head, well, the monarch is the head of the church, but this is in the Church of England, unlike the Episcopal Church in the United States, there's a hierarchy to episcopacy or bishops, right? So the Archbishop of Canterbury is seen as the premier and has throughout history, in Christian history, is the premier archbishop in England. right? The other is the Archbishop of York. They're not quite equal, but they're almost equal. But this is the head of the Church of England, right underneath, you might say, the Queen or the King now, right? Long about the 30s and 40s, the idea came that you're officially an Anglican church if you are in communion with the Archbishop of Canterbury, right? And so the Archbishop of Canterbury really just kind of decided, which churches around the globe still are in communion with the Archbishop of Canterbury, and they created this group, right? If you want to be a little cynical, nobody's ever accused me of being cynical at occasion, but they created a club called the Anglican Communion. They created a club, a men's club, because there were no female clergy, right? Called the Anglican Communion. And they just came up with a decision. Once every 10 years, the Archbishop of Canterbury would invite all the lead bishops or the head bishops of every church throughout the world that used to be part of the Church of England to Canterbury for a conference called the Lambeth Conference, right? So this is once every 10 years, all the main bishops of the Anglican Communion come to Canterbury for basically, originally, just, having a scotch, and the Queen, the monarch held a garden party for them at Buckingham Palace. And that's really what happened at this once every 10-year gathering for a really long time, right? There are a lot of Anglican churches, by the way, in Africa, in many of the African countries. By the way, there are roughly 80 million, the second largest Christian group in the world, Anglican throughout the world. 90% are in Africa.
Wow.
90% are not white. Right? A report just came out last week that in the entire United Kingdom, only 549,000 people go to an Anglican church on Sunday. So let's leave that to a side for now. But so 90% are in Africa, right? So we get this Lambeth Conference once every 10 years, where all the lead bishops of all the Anglican churches throughout the world come together in Canterbury. And gradually they started discussing theology and church and how to do church. And then about 30 years ago now, it started to get a little rambunctious, this group. Because some of the churches throughout the globe started doing things like allowing women to be ordained, right? So you had some churches throughout the globe, Anglican churches, for whom that was verboten. That's against the Bible even, right? And then you had some like us where we did not think it was against the Bible. And so this meeting every 10 years started to get contentious, right? Because this is not just for Christianity, it's kind of in human existence, right? When you commune with a group of people, it doesn't have to be the case, but we tend to believe that you're in agreement with everybody you commune with and that you join, that you're a part of, right? If you really think about things in your life, you know it's not true, right? But nevertheless, this tends to be the way that we kind of work as human beings, right? And some of it's understandable, you don't join I don't know, a Rotary Club that stands for things that are against your values, So you get what I'm saying. So this group started to become contentious, this Lambeth conference once every 10 years. And then it really got bad when some of the denominations throughout the churches throughout the world started to say it was okay for gay people to be ordained as well, right? Then it just really started to get difficult because you can imagine some of the churches didn't want to come to this Lambeth conference if the other churches were going to come and so on and so forth. And then they started to ask for rules in order to be like invited to this, and you had to believe certain things and believe other things. The challenge is that none of these all of these churches that come are completely independent denominations, right? The Archbishop of Canterbury can't call up Michael Curry, the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, and say, you must believe X. You must do Y, because we really are a completely separate denomination. So that still exists. The last Lambeth conference was really difficult because there were more and more gay bishops, right? So not only did that denomination believe in ordaining gay people, but somebody had actually become, a gay person had actually become a bishop, right? And so you'll hear about this in the life of the Episcopal Church, the Anglican Communion and the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lambeth Conference. And so you'll hear about that in the life of the Episcopal Church, right? There are some denominations that have been developed or have developed in the past 20 or 30 years in countries around the globe, including in the United States, that developed because, so in the Episcopal Church, there are some churches that say that they're Anglican, but they've only developed in the past 20 years, right? Because they didn't want gay persons to be ordained or women to be ordained, right? And they want to consider themselves Anglican and be a part of this club, but you can't be a part of this club unless the Archbishop of Canterbury says you're a part of the club. And one of the principles, if you remember from last week, of Christianity in general, but certainly in the Anglican, in the Episcopal Church also, is that we're geographical, right? There can't be two different Anglican denominations in the same geographical area, right? Because then it would be like, who's the bishop of this area, right? And this is not just Episcopal Church. This is same thing in Lutheran and Methodist traditions as well. There aren't two bishops who are overseeing the same geographical area, right? Then you'd have two bishops. Maybe the bishops disagree. Like, who do you follow, right? So
if that's given, anymore.
It's different in the there's greater nuance in the Methodist tradition. And I can't do, I'm not Methodist, I can't do Methodist. So let's leave that to the side, but good question. It's a good question, but I'm probably not the person to answer it. So for example, I told you that I am, as a priest, one of my ordination vows is I promise to follow and obey my bishop, right? So I have to know who my bishop is, right? And so we only have one bishop for Western North Carolina. Another group can't all of a sudden say they're Anglican and have a bishop too in Western North Carolina, right? They can, but the Archbishop of Canterbury is not going to recognize multiple groups in one geographical area. So that's kind of a little bit of, there's a little bit more than you need to know or worry about, because this doesn't touch us on a daily basis at all. But I know there were some questions at the beginning. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so the Episcopal Church of the United States of America does have some, what we call non-domestic dioceses. The Episcopal Church in Haiti is part of the Episcopal Church of the the Anglican Church in Haiti is part of the Episcopal Church, it's an actual diocese of the Episcopal Church. Cuba, Micronesia, and what's that?
Mexico.
There is Mexico, right? Then like Colombia is actually a diocese of the Church of England. So it's the kind of Central America, South America is broken up differently. Most of South America, any Anglican churches are part of the Church of England, actual diocese of the Church of England. A lot of Central America, they're actual diocese of the Episcopal Church. Some of them are independent. Good question. Good question. So you've got, yeah.
Did any like churches pop up in this area?
Yeah, there's a number of congregations in our area that are consider themselves, and what many of them have done is they partnered with the Anglican Church of Nigeria or Uganda. So they're actually a congregation of Uganda. And their bishop is in Uganda. Do you see, you know? So even that doesn't really work. Like we can't set up an Episcopal church in England. We wouldn't do that, right? So it's all kind of interesting dynamic.
Most of them were kind of started with Trinity.
Yeah.
But now.
Yeah, well, they don't call themselves, they call themselves the Anglican Church.
Okay.
You won't, you see the word, the Episcopal Church, you won't see an Episcopal sign, for example. Yeah, yeah. So I wanted to just give you an idea. You're going to hear this phrase, part of the Anglican communion, we are part of, you know, a greater body. The spiritual side of this, that is a blessing, is that we do consider ourselves part of a broader group of people throughout the world, that we are part of a Christian community that doesn't all speak English, doesn't all look like us, that has, you know, different cultural realities. The initial real challenge is, you know, one of the real, you know, things to just consider about the contention of the Lambeth Conference is you've got bishops from Africa who are protesting the fact that there are women clergy and clergy who are gay, but meanwhile, they brought their 3 wives. And somehow that's perfectly okay. So it's interesting, it's a dynamic, you just kind of hold it in tension and move. But then again, when you think those bishops, though, what's going on in their world? They're struggling with their Muslim neighbors deeply. And it's not that they can't live in peace, but that's one of their dynamics, right? And nothing like female clergy or same-sex, you know, or gay individuals would ever be considered anywhere near holy in the Muslim tradition, right? So you have these Anglican bishops that are, you know, it's a lot. It's just, so it gives you, I don't know if you could say it's sympathy, but it gives you the weight of the challenge of what it's like to be a global citizen. And in a faith that is global as well. Right. Oh, yes. They will say they're, but
Having the same issues.
right. Right.
Intriguing.
Very intriguing.
Thinks the Pope is moving.
Right. Yeah. 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 All right. So there is some additional history about the nature of, any questions? The Archbishop of Canterbury did an amazing job at that, I think, anyway, at the last Lambeth conference, and it's almost impossible to hold these tensions together, really. It's almost impossible. But
Do you think they're gonna?
well, I don't think so. I think we're gonna keep on keeping on. I mean, that was one of the principles, that we stay in communion. That we stay in communion. Yeah. Oh, it was only 3 or 4 years ago. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yes.
Since he's the one that fights
His position on,
women.
yes. So there are women clergy in the Church of England. There are not gay clergy in the Church of England, and that's something that they are struggling with deeply right now. And we'll see where that goes, right? Because there's no separation of church and state. And many of the members of parliament are saying they should just pass a law that says it has to be so. And you see this tension starting to come from a modern day place where there's no separation of church and state. It's very interesting, very interesting. Okay,
So
other questions?
They have to.
Parliament can pass any law church law that it wants. As a matter of fact, if the church wants a different law, Parliament has to approve it. Yeah, yeah. There's all these types of agreements about how this happens, so that Parliament doesn't end up being the one who does it, right? So a church commission recommends to Parliament X law. But, this is like, England is the English is, theoretically, the king could dissolve Parliament tomorrow. He would never do it, right? Because it might mean the end of the monarchy, right? But theoretically, the king could do that. So all these kind of things exist in England, that are gentlemen's agreements type of thing, really. So anyway, all right, questions here about this? All right, good. Yes, yes. The Archbishop of Canterbury lives in the Lambeth. Yep. And it's been the Archbishop of Canterbury's residency even before the Church of England. Yeah, yeah. Great. All right. Super. Okay. Let's now shift a little bit. We have some time. I want to shift a little bit to your Book of Common Prayer. So pull out your Book of Common Prayer. Here is, and once again, we'll do this, let's do it this way. We did this first class, but just open up to there's no page number on it. Open up to the table of contents. It's right after this page that says the Book of Common Prayer. Maybe you can see it online or not, probably not, but open up to your table of contents. Right. So I just want to go over how the sacraments of this book are organized. You have the daily office is what starts off the Book of Common Prayer. So let me just stop for a minute and talk about this. This book, the Book of Common Prayer, was first compiled by then Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, in the mid 1500s, at a moment of crisis in the life of the church in England before there was the Church of England. The crisis, of course, was the crisis of King Henry VIII's life, really. This was the immediate crisis, right? But there had been voices speaking against and about corruption in the church for over 100 years before then. They started, frankly, believe it or not, in Poland, what is now Poland, and some other areas around there, moved through the continent. And so there was the big name and face that was is now attached to these voices is Martin Luther, of course, who as a monk came up with a list of grievances, if you will, about corruption in the church, theses, if you will, that he nailed to the church door in Wittenberg, right? His goal was to reform the church, not to create his own church, but to reform the church, right? So you have in Europe and in England, lots of foment, if you will, conversation, questions about the church, about corruption in the church, how to take care of corruption in the church. And we could go through what the grievances were. My favorite from Martin Luther's thesis is basically, besides, who knows if people want to be let out of purgatory or not? I just love that. It's like so even though the immediate crisis is Henry VIII, you remember the story, right? Married to Catherine of Aragon, who had been married to his brother, Arthur, who died within a year of their marriage. And then she marries the younger son, Henry, who becomes king, right? They have a child, Mary, early on in their marriage, but then no son, right? To hand on the kingdom to. This Tudor dynasty would be lost, if you will, if there was no heir. So he decides that he wants to divorce Catherine. And Catherine, though, comes from a family that is very connected to the Pope. And the Pope will not grant a divorce, right? So Henry gets with his counselors, all of who had what then was being called Protestant sympathies, right? And says, what are we going to do about this? And Thomas Cranmer is the one who just said, well, we will now consider you the head of the church. The king is the head of the church. That's why to this day, the king is still the head of the church, because it's a symbolic, event that happened, right? So the king is proclaimed the head of the church, and the divorce happens not from papal authority, but just by the king's own authority. He marries Anne Boleyn, right? But when that divorce happens, when the church in England becomes the Church of England, right? We have to, how are we going to worship? Because worship is centered around the authority of the church, and the one who is in charge is the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, right? How are we going to worship? At the same time, the Protestant sympathies and foment of the time, one of the great grievances that Protestantism the Protestant, folks with Protestant sympathy were making was that worship ought to be done in the language of the people. Right? It was all done in Latin. Even then, the people didn't understand Latin. Right? If they knew how to read and write to begin with. Right? If they even knew how to read and write to begin with. So that was one of the core kind of principles going around, was that worship should be in the language of the people. So Thomas Cranmer not only made the proclamation that this was no longer the church in England, but the Church of England, that Henry would be the head of the church, but he also compiled the very first book of common prayer. We need worship in England. There had been a translation of the Bible into English, and now that was, instead of being banned, it was public, and you could have a Bible in a language that you could read. I hope you get the feeling of what this must have felt like, you know, this kind of freedom, this kind of like, I too have access to the worship of the church, right? So he writes the first book of common prayer because, and at the same time, what was happening, just a little bit more history, we grieve this today. If you ever go on a tour of England and you see the monastic ruins, we grieve it today. But what Henry did at that time, all of the church, almost all of the church in Europe as well, was centered around monastic communities, right? If you lived in a village in England, there would be within your reach a monastic community with a huge cathedral. That's where you would go to church, right? The monks, the economy of the church that the monks ran would be the economy in which you lived and sold your wares. And so the wealth of the country was in the monasteries. And Henry said, we're getting rid of all the monasteries and I'm taking all the wealth, which is what he did, right? So one of the principles in England at the time was we are handing the worship of the church to the people. You get to be part of the worship of the church. It's no longer going to be controlled by the monks in the monasteries. You get to participate in the worship of the church as well. But this book is based on the worship that was happening in the monasteries. We're going to take the worship that was in the monasteries, we're going to put it into English, and we're going to put it in a book that is common prayer, right? The book of common for everyone prayer. So prayer for the common people. Prayer for everyone, right? So when you go to the table of contents, this is all to describe the table of contents. The daily office are the prayers for every day that were happening in the monasteries. Now there were 7 or 9 cycles of prayer each day in a monastery. You don't get all 9 cycles of prayer, but you get some of them. All right, we have morning prayer. We have evening prayer. Now, with this prayer book that was last revised in 1979, you get versions that are in Elizabethan English, thee, thou, and versions that are not in Elizabethan English. That's what's called Rite 1 and Rite 2, because we had all been, before 1979, the prayer book was completely in Elizabethan English. So that's all that the Rite 1 and Rite 2 signifies. The services are a little different too, but so you get morning prayer, you get evening prayer, you get noonday prayer, right? And then page 127, Compline, that's prayer before you go to bed, right? Then with this prayer book, you have a small section which is very helpful, page 137, daily devotions for individuals and families. right? So that's daily prayer, right? And it's to mimic the daily prayer that was the life in the monastic community. The Great Litany is an individual prayer specific and unique to the Anglican Church. We use it occasionally here. It was originally an agricultural feast, right? It was the people would come, the priest would come to your farm and process around the property, praying for, plenty, right? For your crops, right? It ended up becoming it's a kind of a penitential office, right? Where you're confessing, because a lot of the agricultural ceremonies came about when there was what? Famine. So forgive us if you're doing to this us because we did something wrong. Forgive us, good Lord. Forgive us, right? Yeah, the beating of the bounds. Yes, very much so. And then we have some services. We have the collects are just prayers that collect the thought of the day, right? So for every Sunday of the year, and there's a 3-year cycle, we have a prayer that collects the thoughts, the purpose of the day. And then for holy days and saints days, and we have those both in Elizabethan English and contemporary English. We have services for feasts of the Christian life, Ash Wednesday, Palm Sunday, Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and the Great Vigil of Easter. Then we have the sacrament of baptism, its own sacrament, baptism. And then we have the sacrament of the Eucharist, or the Lord's Supper, or the Divine Office, or the Mass, or all of these titles for communion are valid in the Episcopal Church. There's not one over the other. You have Eucharist is the Greek for communion. And when this prayer book was written in the late 70s, there was kind of this pride of going, how can we go back to the earliest things, if you will. So it's titled Eucharist here. And for the Eucharist, we have both Rite 1 and Rite 2. It includes prayers of the people, communion under special circumstances. If you're sick and you can't get to church, people can bring communion to you. And then we have what's called pastoral services, weddings, funerals, last rites, if you will, that's ministration at the time of death. And then we do have in the Episcopal Church what's commonly called confession. It's not a requirement as it is in the Roman Catholic tradition, but we do have the sacrament of confession. And that's what's called reconciliation of a penitent, page 447. And for those who would wish to make a confession, you simply call one of the priests of the church and make an appointment. We don't hold public times of confession the way that they do in the Roman Catholic tradition, but just making an appointment with a priest. And I'd love to say a little bit more about that, but let me just leave it for a moment. And then we have ordination services, or what's called Episcopal services, of a bishop, of a priest, of a deacon. Let me stop for a minute and just say a few words about that. So we have 3 orders of ministry in the Episcopal Church. We have 4 really. Being baptized, baptism is an order in the church. You are one of the baptized, right? So you have an order in the church, simply being baptized, right? The ordained orders are bishop, priest, and deacon. So these are the ordained orders in the Episcopal Church. In the Episcopal Church, a deacon is an ordained person, often non-stipendiary. In other words, they don't get paid. And their role is liturgically to proclaim the gospel. That's why you see our deacon read the gospel, and to care for the needs of the poor. This is an ordained order in the life of the Episcopal Church. Some of you may be familiar in other traditions. Deacon is a role of service in the life of the church. It's not, you don't go through an ordination rite. So in the Baptist tradition, there would be what do they call it, a council of deacons, or anyway, you would, to be a part of the deacons would be a part of those who are responsible for pastoral care and other, and then when you're no longer in that group, you're no longer a deacon of the church. So all these are ordained positions for life in the Episcopal Church. They're all for life. There's an entire book of the Bible in the Book of Common Prayer, the Book of Psalms. Starts on page 585. And then you have prayers. And then you have what's called the Catechism, or the Outline of Faith. We actually have a catechism in here that it can be helpful, And then we have lectionaries, which is what are the Bible readings we're reading on Sunday morning? What are the Bible readings that you would, if you were doing the daily office prayers every morning and every evening, what passages from the Bible would you read? And that's listed under where it says the daily office lectionary. So you can see how this book developed as a book of common prayer. And it has been up to now, maybe a little less with this one, but has often been very much a book of both common prayer and personal devotion. I think I said this in the first session where we were together. Before we had services both in Elizabethan English and in contemporary English and so on and so forth. This book was a lot thinner. And they made little teeny versions. And you really kind of have it on your hip. Be beside your bed. It would be beside the chair that you sat in. It would be kind of a book of personal prayer and devotion, as much as it held services for common worship in public. It would often be a book of a personal prayer book, if you will. And you can still have that with this one. The next one you will not. If they revise this, which I'm not sure they will, it will become a book of liturgical options. I'm not trying to be negative. We're at that place in time that it will become a book of liturgical options. You know, it's time to have communion, turn to page 355. There's 10 choices to choose from, type of, you know, it will become more a priest's manual than it will be what it has had in the past. That's why I argue just leave it alone and go ahead and create all those things anyway, but just leave this alone. Yeah, there are some additional, over the course of the past 30 years, there's been additional authorized services by the Episcopal Church that aren't formally in the Book of Common Prayer. So yes, I can choose to use those. Yeah, I could choose to use those. Yeah. Because, great question, why did they include the entire book of Psalms? because in the monastic tradition, it was your tradition to read the Psalms every single day and over the course of 30 days to read the entire book of Psalms. And let's open to page. It still is maintained in this book. So if you open to page 585. Says the Psalter, which is another term for the book of Psalms, and it says book 1. These are all monastics indications. Book 1, first day morning prayer. And you would read Psalm 1, Psalm 2, Psalm 3, 4, 5, and then evening prayer, it says first day evening prayer. And you would read Psalm 6, 7, and 8, day 1. So that's how the monks read the Psalms. So that's how the entire book of Psalms got into the Book of Common Prayer.
Would they read the morning prayer? That was like at the beginning of the book,
Yes,
and then the 6 Psalms.
Yes. Yeah. because there's a space in morning prayer for the reading of the Psalms. Yeah. Yeah. Great question. Great question. Yeah. What characterizes a sacrament? Yeah, that's a whole class. So I'll do that. What do we consider as sacraments in the Episcopal Church? That's a great question. And so I'm going to do an entire class that's on the sacraments of the church. Great question.
How does the Book of Common Prayer work in conjunction with the Bible? I mean, it seems like, was this meant to be all you needed?
No, no. Although in the previous version of the Book of Common Prayer, the readings for Sunday, there was only one set. You would read the same readings every third Sunday of Epiphany. They were in the Book of Common Prayer, printed. See how it was more a personal devotional? It was easier for it to be a personal devotion book. You didn't need to go to many other books for it. But no, it was never meant to not be replace the Bible by any sense. But it was actually a worship services that enshrined the scripture readings. Because in morning prayer, there's a list of Bible readings and evening prayer. You know, we read more scripture in Episcopal services than you will probably find at a Baptist service. Sorry, but the preacher decides what passage they want to preach on, and that's all that's read, and that's what the preacher preaches on, right? Here in the Episcopal Church, you'll get a reading, you'll get the psalm, you'll get often another reading, then you'll get the gospel reading. So in some ways, we are reading more Bible, if you will. Structure to Bible reading and reflecting on the scripture. Yeah, great question. Okay, the very first Book of Common Prayer was 1549, right? We could do prayer books too, right? Yeah. So the first Book of Common Prayer, 1549, Thomas Cranmer writes it. Then Henry dies, right? His son comes to the throne of minority, right? His counselors were even more I could go through, you know, how Protestant really was Henry. Maybe he really wasn't. But his son was very Protestant, and all the counselors around him, they rewrite the book in 1552. The services become even more stark, if you will, Protestant stark. That's when you start to get laws that say you have to take out the crucifixes from the church, and you can't have an altar up against the wall, and all this type of stuff. Then Edward dies, and Mary comes back to the throne. The entire church goes back to being under the Bishop of Rome, right? All the stuff comes back. Thomas Cranmer gets burned at the stake for being a heretic, for everything he's done. Then she dies, and Elizabeth comes back comes to the throne, everything goes back to being Protestant. And that's where you start to get the laws. It really was Elizabeth I that made the Church of England the Church of England. You get the laws that say everybody must worship according to the Book of Common Prayer. We will have one prayer book. We will have one set of services going on in this realm at all times. And that's when the Church of England was excommunicated. It was not excommunicated under Henry or under his son. And then Mary brought it back, but it was when Elizabeth really established the Church of England as the Protestant faith that things got cemented for the way that they kind of are now. Yeah. Great questions. Love it. All right, we're done for today. We are going to do sacraments next. And so I look forward to that next week. Thank you.